So to summarize the last mimer, and then we're going to ask a question, I'd like to get your perspective. So the last mimer described this relationship between the male and female in such a way that, of course, the male has to greet the female, so to speak. And we explained that every relationship begins in this way. There's a giver and receiver, and the giver has to access the receiver, bring the receiver into their mindset, into their philosophical world or emotional world or whatever the element is. And as a result of that, they will be able to receive together. It's not just a one-way transmission, there's also a two-way. And the two of them are able to both gain as a result and, in fact, grow in on a cosmic level, on a much, much, much higher level. So that was really what was described in the previous mimer. And we brought down these two analogies, and at first glance, you don't really see the benefit of bringing the analogies so much. So one analogy was between a teacher and student, that the teacher begins his class with a joke or some kind of way to be able to access the students and bring the students into the mood of the class. And then the second one was with regards to a father and child. The father needs to bend down, pick the child up, and get to face in order to be able to play, to be able to have the relationship. Now we're going to bring this really down into the reality of our world. And the ideas are true in general, but we're going to discuss the spiritual and the physical elements of intimacy with regards to how the male and female interact and what the process is. And before we get into that, I'd like to ask you, we live in a very, very sexualized world, and that's brought us to very, very interesting places in terms of the way the world exists right now. I find it mind-blowing that the drinks that I have in my refrigerator, you have blackout berry, and then triple X. Vitamin water has a flavor called triple X, and they have some kind of subtle, inappropriate remarks on the bottle. And then you have companies called Naked and anything like that in order to sell drinks, as that sex sells. But it's quite remarkable how over-sexualized our world is. So I want to open the floor up to be able to get your perspective. Maybe you disagree with me, and that's part of the conversation, is really to understand what would you say are the areas in which we've gone wrong, so to speak, as a society with regards to the world of intimacy and sexuality. I'd like to hear that from you. So anybody have any insights into that?
I think that the world is in an essential fever: sexuality, materialism, violence, and it's just you watch an evening TV and we get all three of those, and so we're caught in this kind of on a knife edge, as it were. And I think the Jewish people, we're always represented over the ages morality in the true sense, and I think we're going to come under a lot of pressure as it gets worse on the other side. This fever, as it were.
Okay, so you're mentioning this kind of degradation into very, very physical, the elemental physical elements of life, I guess, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, and it's pandering up to it. It's no discipline.
Okay, excellent. And no discipline is an incredibly important part of it. Go ahead, Ben.
Hollywood is a big
I
part of that.
think that the
Okay.
world became very self-gratifying feelings. People are just looking for self-gratification, either physical or otherwise. It doesn't always have to be physical, but self-gratification became very big. They're not thinking of the fellow man. They're not thinking of God. They're thinking just to gratify their animal soul, maybe, or something.
I think that's an incredibly important thing, and we're going to touch upon that very, very, very seriously in this mimer. And just to point out, you mentioned Hollywood, and you're absolutely right. Go find me one Hollywood movie, or conceptually one Hollywood movie that doesn't deal with either adultery, stealing, or murder. I'm saying that basically that's those three right there, or some elements of those three, are really the essence of if they say that 98.7% of all statistics are made up, and this statistic is going to be made up as well. But if we had to assume, I would say that well over 99% of Hollywood movies deal with elements of those three, and not about the good people coming on top. The good guy always commits adultery, and then they kind of look the other direction, or there's always these shady kind of things that they deal with. It's not about the person overcoming their desires. Anybody else? Okay, so we'll continue. And, if anybody has something to say about this, please, I do want to hear from you. When I was studying before getting married, the rabbi pointed out that sexuality in our world is looked at in one of two ways, either from the Christian perspective of the original sin, and so therefore it is evil, it is wrong, and basically we have to do it because we have to do it, and that was one way of looking at things, which doesn't really make any sense whatsoever, because the fact of the matter is that if human beings saving a life is considered a holy and positive act by every single culture in the world, then certainly creating, or even the potential of creating life, should be a holy act, should not be a dirty act, should not be a negative act in any way whatsoever. So this Christian theology of original sin is really, it's perverted. But the other extreme, which has overcome that extreme, is the one of Greek thought, pure hedonism. Sexuality is something that we need to dive into and uncover, and we need to maximize pleasure and all those kinds of things that unfortunately nowadays our world is very, very much focused on. And I think this is what both of you were saying with regards to the ideas of self-gratification, as well as with regards to the massive amounts of these influences that every single one of us, let alone our children and grandchildren. I don't have grandchildren yet, thank God. But we're faced with these every single day when we drive on the highway, when we turn on our phone, when we check our emails, and that's really, really remarkable. This mimer is going to talk about intimacy, not sexuality. And it's going to note where that sexuality comes from in very, very, very subtle tones. A lot of people don't learn this mimer properly because they don't realize the importance, they don't realize the fact that these very, very physical ideas are couched in very Kabbalistic terms. But I think it's really important. I think it's really important because we need to understand what intimacy is in Judaism, what intimacy is in spiritual thought, in order for us to be able to keep ourselves on, the Jewish path and not on the Christian path, God forbid, and certainly not on the Greek path. So the first chapter summarizes the previous Rebbe's mimer and starts to crack it open a little bit. So of course we start, Lecha, Dodi, Lekrat Kala, Pnei Shabbat, Nekamla, come my beloved to greet the bride, let us go to greet the face of the Shabbat. And this was said by the Rebbe in 1954. The previous Rebbe begins this mimer with this quote and immediately explains that a groom is compared to a king and a bride to a queen. And these two are also used as analogies for God and the Jewish people. And in the framework of the Sfirot, they refer to Za, meaning the first 6 emotive attributes, Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, and Malchut. And we explained that Za, in other words, those 6 Sfirot are determined as the male aspect of the system of creation because they are primarily focused on one particular aspect. And each one of them carries its energy into Malchut. Malchut is not a particular energy of all of the above, but it is a combination of all of these Sfirot, and it supersedes all of these Sfirot. Malchut has 2 different elements of it. On the one hand, it is the last of the Sfirot. So you count all the way down. Malchut, of course, means royalty. And you would think, why would royalty be the final of all the Sfirot? The culmination, though, is not the same thing as the final. And in fact, that question was asked to the Alter Rebbe when he was arrested. That was one of the questions they were trying to prove that he was rebelling against the king. They said, well, in the Sfirot that you quote, Malchut is the last one, so therefore, obviously, you hate the king. And that was one of the things he had to explain. But Malchut also creates. So vis-a-vis the next world, Malchut becomes Keter. It becomes the crown of the next world. So you have, for example, Atzilut. Malchut of Atzilut itself becomes Keter of the following world of Bria. So Malchut is not a simple concept when we say that Malchut is the last. It is a much broader idea. And Malchut, in fact, as the feminine concept, is much broader and much more infinitely detailed than these individual Sfirot. And that's something that we're going to explore a little bit. So the Rebbe continues and says, the deeper insight into this statement is as follows. In order for there to be a proper transmission from the giver, the Za, or the groom / the king, or the weekday, to the recipient, which is Malchut, the bride, the queen, or Shabbat, the giver must initiate the relationship in an external fashion, external both in regards to the giver and receiver. As a result, the recipient will be uplifted into the space of the giver and will be able to receive properly in an internal fashion. What did that mean? Well, the Rebbe then brings 2 analogies to this idea. The transmission of knowledge from a teacher to a student, and the father wishes to play with this toddler child. So we explained, like we said before, that the teacher needs to begin the class with some kind of opener in order to be able to get the class into that space, whether it's a joke or a riddle or something to be able to create that relationship. And the father wants to play with his child, which is really essentially not for the play itself, but for the deeper relationship. Needs to pick the child up and get eye to eye with the child. He needs to bend himself down. He needs to, in the psychological world, it would be, he needs to leave his adult world and go into the space of the child in order to be able to establish that relationship. The Rebbe continues and says, the reason that the previous Rebbe brought these two analogies is not just to give us insight into the process of transmission, that the process is that the giver needs to first begin the process, but also to focus in on the spiritual qualities and advantages of both of these types of transmission, both the external as well as the internal transmission. One might think that the external transmission is just a necessary step prior to getting to the inner transmission, but in actuality, even the external relationship stems from an extremely high level in the divine, to the extent that it even has an advantage over the internal transmission. And that's something we're going to explore. Because you would think, what is a joke vis-a-vis the class? It's external, it's just a stepping stone. It's a propulsion device into the class, but it's not really essential to the class itself. And it's the same thing with regards to picking up the child. What's the point of picking up the child is only to be able to get to the point where we're face to face. But there are other points that no, there's an advantage. There's a spiritual advantage to that original step over the essential purpose of what you're trying to accomplish. The Rebbe continues, this is evident in the fact that the external transmission is from the divine level of makif, the beyond the capacity of the recipient to internalize it. But yet it is only a preparatory step to receiving the inner transmission, because it's specifically through internalization that they can both come to an even higher level, even beyond that of makif. Makif, we explained, is something that is by definition not tangible. It is something, the word makif, of course, means encompassing, beyond. It is something that's aloof, transcendent. And we're going to explain that in this mimer. Right now, we're just giving an overview of where we're going to go in this mimer. But I want to also talk about the kind of the very, very down and, if we're talking about intimacy, the fact of the matter is, and part of the terms that I use, but the relationship is initiated by several steps, whether it means buying flowers, whether it means, a gift of any kind, or whether it means by what we know as foreplay. Those elements are not just there in order to be able to get to sexuality, to actually being intimate itself, but those themselves are essential to the entire process. And here is one of the biggest issues that we see in the world. That in the world, sex is looked at as an ultimate goal. And what we're talking about here is that intimacy is not the same as sex. Sex, two animals can have. But two animals are not going to be intimate. Intimacy is a relationship that is created by a conscious effort, not just an animalistic attraction. And that conscious effort pervades every element of the relationship, going all the way through. A vast amount of divorce happens as a result of miscommunication in sexuality, because of the inability to be able to understand that sexuality is meant to be itself a mechanism that is used within the broader guides of a relationship. And what we're discussing here is the fact is that the idea of the relationship, which is something that's not tangible, which is something that is makif, which is something that is beyond and is not describable, is actually the essential element of what's going on, and it must pervade all elements of intimacy in order for the intimacy to be truly intimate, in order for the intimacy to be not just animalistic. And so we're going to see how this works on several different levels. The Rebbe concludes that this explains the verse over all the glory of the bridal canopy by noting that the plural form al kol kvod chuppah, kol is a plural form, means all, and therefore it means more than one, and it denotes two types of glory: the glory of the bride and the glory of the groom. The canopy al kol kvod chuppah encompasses them both and brings them beyond the levels of bride and groom. It brings them beyond just the levels of receiver and giver, but it brings them to the levels of what are referred to in the Kabbalistic idea as Abba and Ima, which of course mean father and mother, but they are the spiritual counterparts of Chachma and Bina, which means accessing the deepest elements of the relationship through actual parenthood, actually giving birth. So this growth of human beings is not just the physical contact of two people, male and female, but as they growth into a different space, a space of unity, a space of common purpose, a space of something that encompasses all of these things, and in fact beyond these things, and that is the purpose, of course, of having a chuppah, and that's the idea of the entire process of the wedding ceremony, is that it's supposed to remind both of them about this process. There's a tremendous amount of focus, of course, on the male, because the male's responsibility in Judaism is to take care of the female. He has the individual mitzvah of what's referred to as onah, which means giving his wife pleasure. She does not have a mitzvah to give him pleasure. There are details to this, and it's not a simplistic, well, it's only him and it's not on her at all. There's more to it. But in terms of the actual contractual obligation, because of the fact that the husband is a giver and he has to recognize that that's his job, is to give. And I would venture to say that the husband needs to recognize this more than the wife, because I think it's more natural, of course, for the women in general to be nurturers. And so therefore that's a more natural element of their being. And they have to remind themselves to receive. It's very difficult sometimes for women to remind themselves that, okay, I need to be able to take for myself, not just to be a nurturer. And so the wedding ceremony actually is reflective of both this. There's the classic joke, of course. Why is it that it's the husband who breaks the glass? Because that's the last time he'll be able to put his foot down. And why is it that the husband is the one who says, Hariyat Mikudeshet? Because that's the last time he'll be able to get a word in edgewise. So those are the classic jokes. But the idea is to remind us of what our responsibility is against our natural inclination. The natural inclination for the male is to be focused on sex as itself. And the entire ceremony is meant to spin up this idea that is about the relationship. It's about the effort that you put into it. It's a natural relation, it's the natural response for a female to be nurturing. And she forgets sometimes to receive, to take into herself, to stop and just be. And that's what we're going to discuss. And the Rebbe says this clearly. He says this is all a paradigm for the unity of a male and female, both in their spiritual and physical counterparts. even though the honor or glory that is received is one of the loftiest levels of makif, still is precisely through the actual union of male and female, the internal transmission, that the essence can be accessed. So we can talk about the relationship from today until tomorrow, but the fact of the matter is that when it comes down to it, the essence is actually accessed through the intimate act. And where do we see that? Because of the fact that now we have the potential, of course, for the creation of a human being. And that creation is itself a revelation of the infinite of God, the infinity of God. God gives us the ability to be able to procreate just as He is a creator. And we're given access to that. Now, of course, you can procreate without the intimate world. You can procreate through, God forbid, a person, I don't want to say you, a person can procreate, of course, through rape, through incest, or anything else that is inappropriate. Animals, of course, procreate, as we said before, oftentimes by force. And the Talmud tells us something very powerful, that the words ish and isha have the same letters, but the difference is the middle, is the two letters. The two letters of Aleph and Shin spell the word fire, and the difference between the two words is a Yud and a Hey, which spells God's name. So the Talmud says that if a male and a female merit, the divine presence will dwell among them, and if not, Esh ochaltam, fire will consume them. And the fire that we're not talking about is not fire, it's physical fire. It's talking about the fire of misplaced passion, of anger, the fires that are inappropriate, the fires of lust, as opposed to the fire of godliness. So when a person takes this approach and they absorb this into their intimate world, and they recognize that this is actually a godly act, that this is part of my purpose, is to be able to unite and to be able to create something that's beyond myself, well, that itself is of tremendous value. So that's what we're going to explore. And now what the Rebbe is going to do in the next 2 chapters is to be able to explain each of the ideas, each of the analogies, and then, of course, the previous Rebbe's conclusion. And we'll understand why the previous Rebbe had to bring these specific analogies, what are the details within them, and to focus on this idea that the external transmission, the relationship that is created through things that seem to be pointless, flowers, of course, they'll die tomorrow, so why should I give them today if they're just going to be dead? I can spend $20 on something else and we'll be happier, right? But that's not what it's about. The same thing with regards to the effort that's put into the, if you want to put it, the romantic side of life, whatever it is, you want to put it that way, you can put it that way. And that there's an advantage to it, and we're going to discuss where that comes from, the spiritual counterparts of those ideas. Any questions or any comments? Come on, we have 2 minutes left, and Rabbi Smith just came on. I don't want to hand the mic over to him too quickly. Any thoughts about what we've been saying today?
Very nicely presented, really. Enjoyed that. Emes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Yestrin. Have a wonderful Shabbos.